The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of rain that feels like the sky is punishing the earth. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as the wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge. The highway was eerily empty, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the slick asphalt ahead, but beyond that, it was just black. Endless, suffocating black. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:17 a.m. She shouldn't have taken this shortcut. She knew better, but the GPS had promised it would shave 20 minutes off her drive, and she was desperate to get home after the long, exhausting day she'd had. The car had been acting strange for the last 10 miles. A faint sputtering sound, a slight jerk in the engine. She'd ignored it, telling herself it was just the rain, the cold, anything but what she feared, a breakdown. But then it happened. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Just like that. The car rolled to a stop on the shoulder, the headlights flickering before going out completely. Emma sat there for a moment, her heart pounding, the sound of the rain hammering on the roof filling the silence. She tried the ignition once, twice, but the engine didn't even turn over. Just a dead, hollow click. "No, no, no," she muttered, slamming her hands on the steering wheel. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. No service, of course. She was in the middle of nowhere, on a stretch of highway that seemed to have been forgotten by the rest of the world. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Think, Emma. Think. She could wait it out, hope that someone would drive by. But who would be out here at this hour, in this weather? And even if someone did stop, could she trust them? The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. The rain continued to pour, the sound of it almost deafening. Emma's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. She thought about getting out and walking, but to where? The nearest town was miles away, and she had no idea which direction to go. She was trapped, alone, vulnerable. And then, like a mirage in the desert, headlights appeared in the distance. Emma's heart leapt. She squinted through the rain-streaked windshield, watching as the lights grew closer. A truck, an old, beat-up pickup truck. It slowed as it approached, pulling over just ahead of her car. Emma's relief was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. She watched as the driver's side door opened and a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered. He raised a hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. "You okay?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the rain. Emma hesitated, then rolled down her window just a crack. "My car broke down," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't get it started." The man nodded, taking a step closer. "I can take a look if you want. I'm pretty good with cars." Emma's instincts screamed at her to say no, to lock the doors and wait for someone else. But who else was going to come? She was stranded, with no other options. "Okay," she said reluctantly. "Thank you." The man walked around to the front of her car, popping the hood. Emma watched him through the windshield, her heart pounding. He seemed normal, just a guy trying to help. But something about him made her skin crawl. Maybe it was the way he moved, too deliberate, too calm, or the way he kept glancing back at her, his eyes lingering just a little too long. After a few minutes, he closed the hood and walked back to her window. "Looks like your alternator's shot," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Emma's stomach dropped. "What am I supposed to do?" The man shrugged. "I can give you a ride to the next town. There's a motel there. You can call a tow truck in the morning." Emma hesitated. Every fiber of her being was telling her not to get in that truck. But what choice did she have? She couldn't stay here. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." She grabbed her purse and stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking her to the skin. The man opened the passenger side door for her, and she climbed in, the smell of old leather and cigarette smoke assaulting her senses. He got in on the driver's side, and they pulled back onto the highway. For the first few minutes, they drove in silence. Emma kept her eyes on the road, her hands clenched in her lap. The man glanced at her occasionally, but he didn't say anything. The tension in the cab was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "So," he said finally, breaking the silence, "what's a pretty girl like you doing out here all alone?" Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Just heading home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his eyes still on the road. Dangerous road to be on by yourself, especially at night. Emma didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to speak. The man's tone had shifted, just slightly, but enough to send a chill down her spine. They drove for what felt like forever, the rain never letting up. Emma kept expecting to see the lights of the town, but there was nothing, just darkness, endless darkness. And then the man turned off the highway onto a narrow, unpaved road. Emma's heart leapt into her throat. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Shortcut," the man said, his tone casual, "saves time." Emma's mind raced. This wasn't right. This wasn't right at all. She glanced at the door handle, wondering if she could jump out, but they were going too fast and the road was too rough. She'd never make it. The truck bounced along the dirt road, the headlights illuminating nothing but trees and more trees. Emma's fear was a living thing now, clawing at her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had to do something. She had to get out of here. And then the truck slowed, pulling into a clearing. There was a small, dilapidated cabin there, barely visible in the darkness. The man parked the truck and turned off the engine. Emma's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man turned to her, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Home," he said simply. And then, before she could react, he reached over and grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. Emma screamed, thrashing against him, but he was too strong. He dragged her out of the truck, her feet slipping in the mud as she struggled to break free. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing in the empty clearing. The man didn't respond. He just kept dragging her toward the cabin, his grip unrelenting. Emma's mind was a whirlwind of panic and fear. She had to get away. She had to. As they reached the door of the cabin, Emma made one last, desperate attempt to break free. She kicked out, her foot connecting with the man's shin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench her arm free. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The man was right behind her, his footsteps heavy in the mud. Emma didn't look back. She just ran, her legs burning, her lungs on fire. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but she didn't care. She had to get away. She plunged into the woods, the branches tearing at her skin, the rain making the ground slick and treacherous. She could hear the man behind her, his breathing heavy, his footsteps relentless. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just had to keep moving. And then she tripped. Her foot caught on a root and she went down hard, the impact knocking the breath out of her. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The man was on her, his hands grabbing her, pulling her back. Emma screamed, thrashing against him, but he was too strong. He dragged her back toward the cabin, her struggles growing weaker as exhaustion and fear took over. And then, just as they reached the door, a sound cut through the night. A car engine. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the rain. The man froze, his grip on Emma loosening just enough for her to break free. She stumbled away from him, her legs trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The car pulled into the clearing, the headlights illuminating the scene. A woman stepped out, her face pale in the light. She held a gun in her hand, steady and unwavering, pointed directly at the man. "Step away from her," the woman commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Emma and the woman. He took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, his tone casual, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I said step away," the woman repeated, her voice cold and unyielding. The man took another step back, his hands still raised. Emma stumbled toward the woman, her legs barely able to support her. The woman kept her gun trained on the man, her eyes never leaving him. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice softer now but still firm. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered, "help me." The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her eyes never leaving the man. He took another step back, then turned and disappeared into the woods. Emma collapsed to the ground, sobbing, her body shaking with relief and fear. The woman knelt beside her, wrapping her in a blanket from the car. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe now." But Emma knew better. She knew that the man was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, and she knew that she would never forget the look in his eyes, the cold, calculating stare that had promised nothing but pain. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing in the rain. They took Emma's statement, searched the area, but the man was gone, vanished into the night. Emma sat in the back of the police car, wrapped in a blanket, her mind still reeling. She had come so close, too close, and she knew that she would never feel safe again. As the car pulled away from the clearing, Emma glanced back at the cabin, now just a dark shadow in the rain. And she knew, deep in her heart, that the man would be back. And next time, she might not be so lucky. The woman with the gun had saved her life, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man was still out there, and he would be looking for her. She would have to be ready. She would have to be strong. But for now, she was safe, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of survival and suspense, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Remember, the world can be a dark and unpredictable place. Always trust your instincts and stay aware of your surroundings.
Next story.
Sophia had always loved the movie theater. The dim glow of the projector, the smell of buttery popcorn, the way the world outside seemed to vanish the moment the lights dimmed. It was her sanctuary. She had been working at the Starlight Cinema for 3 years now, first as an usher, then as a ticket seller, and finally as the assistant manager. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and she enjoyed the routine. The theater was an old building, its walls lined with faded posters of films from decades past, and its floors creaked with the weight of countless footsteps. It had a charm to it, a kind of nostalgic magic that Sophia found comforting. But lately that comfort had begun to fray at the edges. It started with small things, a misplaced set of keys, a faint unfamiliar scent in the break room, the feeling of being watched when she was alone in the lobby, counting the day's earnings. At first, Sophia brushed it off. The theater was old, after all. Keys got lost, scents lingered, and the feeling of being watched, well, that was just her imagination, wasn't it? But then the notes began to appear. The first one was tucked into the pocket of her coat, which she had left hanging in the break room. It was a small slip of paper, neatly folded, with a single sentence written in blocky, uneven letters. "I like the way you smile when you think no one is looking." Sophia stared at it, her stomach twisting. She showed it to her coworker, Mark, who laughed it off. "Probably just some weirdo trying to be poetic," he said. "Don't let it get to you." But it did get to her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close to her, close enough to slip something into her pocket without her noticing. The notes kept coming. They appeared in her locker, tucked under the windshield wiper of her car, even slipped into the cash register drawer. Each one was more unsettling than the last. "Your hair looks pretty in the moonlight. I dream about the sound of your voice. I know where you live." Sophia began to dread going to work. She started locking her locker, checking her car before she got in, glancing over her shoulder as she walked through the parking lot. She told herself it was just some harmless creep, someone who would eventually get bored and move on. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Whoever was doing this wasn't going to stop. Then, one night, as she was closing up the theater, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the projection room. Her heart leapt into her throat. She was alone, or at least she was supposed to be. Mark had left an hour ago, and the last movie had ended. The theater was empty, or so she thought. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get her attention. Sophia's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That she heard a noise? They would think she was overreacting. Instead, she grabbed the heavy flashlight she kept under the counter and made her way toward the projection room. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the exit sign at the far end. The tapping grew louder as she approached the door. She paused, her breath shallow, and pressed her ear against the wood. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, came from the other side. Sophia. Her name. Someone had said her name. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, and fumbled with the flashlight. The beam of light shook as she pointed it at the door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of footsteps moving away. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The tapping, the voice, the footsteps. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she had been on edge because of the notes. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the theater with her, watching her, waiting for her. The next day, she decided to confront Mark. "Have you noticed anything weird lately?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged. "Weird how?" She hesitated, then told him about the notes, the tapping, the voice. His expression darkened. "That's messed up," he said. "You should tell the manager." But Sophia didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Not yet. She convinced herself that if she just ignored it, it would go away. It didn't. A week later, she found another note. This one was longer, more detailed. "I love the way you jump when you're scared. It's so adorable. But don't worry, Sophia. I would never hurt you. Not really. I just want to be close to you, to watch you, to know you. You're so beautiful when you're afraid." She felt sick. Her hands shook as she crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. She couldn't ignore this anymore. She went to the manager, who listened with a furrowed brow and promised to look into it. But days passed and nothing changed. The notes kept coming, The tapping returned, and then one night she saw him. She was walking to her car after closing, the parking lot dimly lit by flickering streetlights. She had just reached her car when she felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. She turned, and there he was, a figure standing at the edge of the lot, half hidden in shadow. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a hood pulled low over his face. She couldn't see his eyes, but she could feel his gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Her breath caught in her throat. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the lock. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching her. Finally, she got the door open and slid inside, locking it behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror as she drove away. He was still there, standing in the shadows, watching her go. That was the breaking point. She called the police, filed a report, told them everything. They took her seriously, or at least they seemed to. They increased patrols around the theater, promised to keep an eye out. But Sophia didn't feel safe. Not at work, not at home, not anywhere. She started carrying pepper spray, checking the locks on her doors and windows multiple times a night. She stopped going out after dark, stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her, waiting. Then one night, he made his move. Sophia was closing up the theater, her nerves on edge as usual. She had just turned off the lights in the lobby when she heard it, a faint creak like a door opening. She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just silence. She told herself it was nothing, just the old building settling. But then she heard it again, a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps. She grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam of light caught a figure just for a moment before it ducked out of sight. Her breath hitched. She was not alone. She backed toward the exit, her eyes darting around the darkened lobby. The figure emerged again, closer this time. She could see him more clearly now. He was wearing a black hoodie, the hood pulled up, and a mask that covered the lower half of his face. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty theater. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst through the exit door and into the parking lot, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the lock. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps growing louder, closer. Finally, she got the door open and slid inside, locking it behind her. She glanced in the rearview mirror as she drove away. He was standing at the edge of the lot, watching her go. She didn't go home that night. She drove to the police station and sat in the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She called the police, told them what had happened. They took her statement, promised to look into it. But Sophia knew it wasn't over. He wasn't going to stop. Not until he got what he wanted. And he wanted her. The next few days were a blur. Sophia barely slept, barely ate. She was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. She quit her job at the theater, but it didn't matter. He knew where she lived. She started seeing him everywhere, standing on the corner outside her apartment, sitting in a car across the street, lurking in the shadows. She called the police again and again, but there was never enough evidence to do anything. She felt like she was losing her mind. Then, one night, he broke into her apartment. She was in bed trying to sleep when she heard it, a faint creak like a window being opened. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just silence. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind. But then she heard it again, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. The operator answered, but before Sophia could speak, she heard it, a voice soft and low coming from the hallway. "Sophia." She dropped the phone and scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear him moving through the apartment, his footsteps slow and deliberate. She grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a lamp, and held it like a weapon. She backed into the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the door. It creaked open, and there he was. He was wearing the same black hoodie, the same mask. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Stay back!" she screamed, holding the lamp out in front of her. He didn't say anything. He just stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. She swung the lamp at him, but he caught it easily, wrenching it from her hands. She stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He was so close now, so close she could smell him, a faint, metallic scent that made her stomach churn. She could see the glint of something in his hand, a knife. Her heart leapt into her throat. She was trapped. There was no way out. And then just as he reached for her, the door burst open. The police. They had come. They tackled him to the ground, wrestled the knife from his hand, cuffed him. Sophia collapsed to the floor, sobbing, her body shaking with relief. It was over. It was finally over. Or so she thought. As they led him away, he turned to look at her, his eyes gleaming with a strange, almost amused light. "This isn't over, Sophia," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'll always find you." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the shattered remains of her life. But the story doesn't end there. Because even though he was behind bars, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching her, waiting. The notes started coming again, this time delivered to her new apartment. The police said it was impossible that he was locked up, that it had to be someone else. But Sophia knew better. She knew it was him. And she knew that no matter where she went, no matter what she did, he would always find her. Because he wasn't just a stalker, he was something more, something darker, and he would never let her go.
Next story.
The wind howled through the empty corridors of Blackwood University, a sprawling campus nestled deep within the heart of a dense, ancient forest. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to lean in closer with each passing day, their shadows stretching long fingers across the cracked pavement. It was the week of Thanksgiving, and the campus was eerily silent. Most students had returned home to their families, leaving the dorms hollow and lifeless. But for Emily Carter, a 21-year-old international student from England, home was too far away. She had decided to stay behind, opting for the solitude of her dorm room rather than the expense and hassle of traveling back for just a few days. Her boyfriend, Matthew, a local student, had promised to stay with her, but at the last minute his family had insisted he come home. Reluctantly, he had left, leaving Emily alone in the desolate dormitory. The first night was uneventful, though the silence was unnerving. Emily had always been a rational person, dismissing ghost stories and urban legends as nothing more than tales to scare freshmen. But as the days passed, the atmosphere began to shift. The dorm, once a place of comfort, now felt oppressive. The lights flickered intermittently, and the heating system groaned as if it were alive. Emily tried to brush it off, attributing it to the aging infrastructure of the building. But then the noises started. It began with a faint tapping on her window late at night. At first, she thought it was the branches of the tree outside, scraping against the glass. But the tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. She pulled the curtains aside, her breath fogging up the cold pane, but there was nothing there, just the endless darkness of the forest beyond. She laughed nervously, chiding herself for being so jumpy. But the tapping continued, night after night, growing louder, more insistent. Soon, it was accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Emily tried to distract herself with studies and movies, but the unease clung to her like a second skin. She called Matthew, her voice trembling as she described the noises. He assured her it was just her imagination, the result of being alone in such a large, empty building. But his words did little to comfort her. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They called her name. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Emily decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but her phone flashlight, she ventured into the hallway. The dorm was a labyrinth of shadows, the faint glow of her phone barely piercing the darkness. The whispers seemed to guide her, leading her to the stairwell at the end of the hall. Her heart pounded in her chest as she descended, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder, the whispers more urgent. She reached the basement, a place she had never been before. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her inside. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and forgotten belongings. The whispers were deafening now, echoing off the concrete walls. Emily's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters around her. She turned a corner and froze. There in the middle of the room was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to her, its form shrouded in darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was her own face, twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes black voids. Emily screamed, the sound tearing through the silence. She turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she stumbled through the maze of rooms. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frenzied. She could hear footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. She burst through the basement door and sprinted up the stairs, her lungs burning. She didn't stop until she reached her room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The next morning, Emily tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare, a product of her overactive imagination. But the memory of that twisted face haunted her. She decided to leave the dorm, to find a hotel or anywhere else to stay. But as she packed her bags, she noticed something strange. Her belongings were not as she had left them. Her clothes were folded in a way she never folded them, her books stacked in an order she didn't recognize. And then she saw it, a note, written in her own handwriting, but she had no memory of writing it. It read, "You can't leave, you belong here." Panic surged through her. She grabbed her phone and called Matthew, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. He answered on the first ring, his voice filled with concern. She told him everything, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He promised to come back immediately, to be there by nightfall. Emily clung to that promise like a lifeline. She just had to make it through one more day. But as the hours passed, the dorm seemed to come alive. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. The lights flickered violently, plunging her into darkness for seconds at a time. She heard footsteps outside her door, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The doorknob rattled, and she stifled a scream. The footsteps moved away, but the relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed, and she nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. It was Matthew. He was on his way, he said, but there was something wrong with his car. He was stuck on the side of the road, miles from campus. He told her to stay put, to lock the doors and wait for him. Emily's heart sank. She was alone, truly alone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just whispers. They were voices, chanting her name. She could feel them in her mind, clawing at her thoughts. She covered her ears, but it did nothing to block them out. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. The door creaked open, and she could hear something moving inside the room. She could feel its presence, cold and malevolent, drawing closer. She backed into the corner, her body trembling. And then she saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, moving toward her. It reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, and she screamed. The next morning, Matthew arrived at the dorm, his face pale with worry. He had managed to fix his car and had driven through the night to reach her. But when he entered her room, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the floor spotless. There was no sign of Emily. He called her name, his voice echoing through the empty halls. He searched the entire dorm, but she was nowhere to be found. As he was about to leave, he noticed something on the desk. A note, written in Emily's handwriting. It read, "I'm still here." Matthew's blood ran cold. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. He could feel them in his mind, clawing at his thoughts. The lights flickered, and he saw her, Emily, standing in the corner of the room, her face twisted into that same grotesque smile. She reached out to him, her fingers long and skeletal, and he screamed. The dorm was silent once more, the whispers gone. But if you listen closely, late at night, you can still hear them. Soft, unintelligible murmurs calling your name. And if you're brave enough to venture into the basement, you might just see them. Emily and Matthew, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes black voids. They're still there, waiting for you to join them. Because once you enter Blackwood University, you can never leave. You belong here. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of Emily and Matthew, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. And remember, the next time you find yourself alone in the dark, listen closely. You might just hear the whispers calling your name.
Next story.
The sun was setting over the sprawling amusement park, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked asphalt pathways. The park, once a vibrant hub of laughter and joy, had fallen into disrepair over the years. The Ferris wheel stood motionless, its gondolas swaying slightly in the evening breeze like empty coffins. The carousel's horses, their paint chipped and eyes hollow, seemed to leer at anyone who passed by. The air smelled faintly of cotton candy and rust, a bittersweet reminder of the park's former glory. It was the kind of place that felt alive, not with joy, but with something darker, something that lingered in the corners and whispered through the empty corridors of the abandoned funhouse. Mara had always been drawn to places like this. At 23, she was a freelance photographer with a fascination for the forgotten and the eerie. She had spent the last few hours capturing the park's decay, the way the sunlight filtered through the broken windows of the ticket booth, the way the weeds had overtaken the once pristine flower beds. Her camera hung heavily around her neck, a constant companion as she wandered deeper into the park. She had come alone, as she often did, but tonight something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the unease clung to her like a second skin. As she approached the old haunted house attraction, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. It was strange. The park had been closed for years, and she was sure she had checked the building earlier in the day. The door had been firmly locked then, the chains rusted and unbroken. Now, the chains lay in a heap on the ground, and the door creaked softly as if inviting her inside. Mara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her camera. She knew she should leave, call it a day, and head back to her car. But the photographer in her couldn't resist. This was the kind of shot that could make her career, a perfect blend of beauty and decay, light and shadow. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mildew tickled her nose. The walls were lined with faded posters of clowns and ghosts, their smiles now twisted and menacing in the dim light. She raised her camera, snapping a few shots, the flash illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts. As she moved deeper into the attraction, she noticed something odd. The props, the fake skeletons, the animatronic monsters, were in surprisingly good condition. Too good. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she passed, and she could have sworn she heard the faint whir of machinery, though the power had been cut years ago. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless, its back to her. It was dressed in a tattered carnival worker's uniform, its head tilted slightly to the side. Mara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She told herself it was just another prop, but the way it stood there, so still, so deliberate, sent a chill down her spine. She took a step back, her heart pounding, and the figure's head snapped around to face her. Its face was a mask, but not the kind you'd find in a costume shop. It was smooth and featureless, save for two small holes where the eyes should be. Mara's scream caught in her throat as the figure lunged toward her, its movements unnaturally fast. She turned and ran, her camera bouncing against her chest, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She could hear it behind her, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, gaining on her with every second. She burst through a side door and into the park, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she reached the carousel, her lungs burning, her legs trembling. She crouched behind one of the horses, trying to steady her breathing, her eyes darting around the park. The figure was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that she had imagined it, that the stress and the eerie atmosphere had gotten to her. But then she heard it, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mara's mind raced. She needed to get out of the park, but her car was on the other side, past the Ferris wheel and the food court. She couldn't risk running in the open. The figure could be anywhere. She decided to cut through the funhouse, a labyrinth of mirrors and narrow passageways that might give her a chance to lose her pursuer. She moved quickly but quietly, her ears straining for any sound. The funhouse was even creepier at night, the mirrors distorting her reflection into grotesque shapes. She turned a corner and came face to face with herself, or rather a version of herself with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She stifled a scream and kept moving. She was almost to the exit when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the figure reflected in one of the mirrors, its featureless mask staring directly at her. She broke into a run, her heart pounding in her ears, the exit just ahead. but as she reached the door, it slammed shut in her face. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The figure was closer now, its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if it knew she had nowhere to go. Mara backed into a corner, her mind racing. She had to think of something, anything. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and held it out in front of her, her hands shaking. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its head tilting to the side as if studying her. Then, without warning, it lunged. Mara swung the glass shard, catching the figure in the arm. It let out a guttural roar and stumbled back, giving her just enough time to dart past it and through a narrow gap in the mirrors. She didn't stop running until she was out of the funhouse and back in the open air. She could see her car now, just a few hundred yards away. She sprinted toward it, her keys already in her hand. She was almost there when she felt a hand clamp down on her shoulder. She spun around, ready to fight, but it wasn't the figure. It was a man, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "You have to help me," he gasped. "There's something in the park. It's been following me." Mara hesitated, torn between her own survival and the desperate look in the man's eyes. But before she could respond, the figure appeared behind him, its featureless mask gleaming in the moonlight. The man didn't even have time to scream before the figure grabbed him and dragged him into the shadows. Mara didn't wait to see what happened next. She jumped into her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. As she sped out of the parking lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the park, its head tilted to the side, watching her go. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, her heart still racing, her mind replaying the night's events over and over. She told herself she was safe now, that the figure couldn't follow her. But as she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something on the passenger seat. A small, featureless mask, its hollow eyes staring up at her. And then she heard the laugh, low and guttural, coming from the back seat. If you enjoyed this chilling tale of forgotten places and lurking shadows, don't forget to subscribe for more eerie adventures. And remember, some doors are better left unopened, and some masks should never be worn.
Next story.
The fluorescent lights in the accounting department of Crestview Industries hummed like trapped insects, casting a pale, sickly glow over Olivia's desk. It was 10:37 p.m., and her third consecutive night working late to finalize the quarterly audit, a project her manager had called career-making in one breath and urgent in the next. The open floor plan of the 22nd floor, usually buzzing with chatter and keyboards, felt cavernous now. Distant janitorial carts rattled near the elevators, and the scent of industrial lemon cleaner lingered in the air. Olivia's fingers trembled slightly as she typed, her third coffee of the night sitting cold beside her. She'd texted her roommate Maya 2 hours ago. "Still here. This place is a ghost town. See you by midnight?" Maya's reply had been a single thumbs-up emoji. At 11:02 p.m., the motion-activated lights in the east wing blinked off, plunging the rows of cubicles into shadow. Olivia froze, her cursor hovering over a spreadsheet. The building's HVAC system shuddered to a stop, leaving a silence so thick she could hear her own pulse. Just a power save mode, she told herself. But then, faintly, a metallic click echoed from the stairwell door down the hall, the one that hadn't fully latched since the fire drill last week. She stood, her chair rolling back with a squeak. "Hello?" Her voice wavered. No answer. The security desk downstairs had been empty when she'd swiped in at 8 p.m., Bud, the night guard, was probably napping in the break room again. She hesitated, then grabbed her phone. No service. The office Wi-Fi, she realized, had disconnected. The first scream of the fire alarm made her jump. It died abruptly, cutting into a static-filled gargle. Olivia's breath hitched. Malfunction. Just a malfunction. But then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing up the stairwell. She ducked behind her cubicle, heart hammering as the stairwell door creaked open. A man's work boots, scuffed and flecked with dried mud, stepped onto the carpet. He paused, his shadow stretching long under the emergency exit sign. Olivia crouched lower, her phone clutched to her chest. The man walked past her aisle, his breath audible, a wet, rasping sound. She caught a glimpse of his reflection in a monitor, a black hoodie, a gloved hand trailing along the cubicle walls. He stopped at the IT department's server room, 30 feet away, and began methodically unplugging cables. A thief? But then he turned, and Olivia saw the knife, a hunting blade, its edge serrated, tucked into his belt. She stifled a whimper. The man's head snapped toward her. For a heartbeat, their eyes met in the monitor's glow. His face was gaunt, lips peeled back in a grin too wide for his skull. Olivia bolted. The chase was silent at first. He didn't shout, didn't laugh, just pursued, his boots thudding as she sprinted past the copy room toward the emergency stairs. The door was propped open with a cinder block. Olivia hurled herself down the concrete steps, her flat slipping on the edge. Behind her, the door slammed shut. A chain rattled. He'd locked her in. She stumbled into the 21st floor lobby, pitch black save for the exit signs. Her hands found the wall, trembling as she inched forward. A low laugh echoed from the vents above. "You're quick," the man crooned. His voice was nasal, almost conversational. "But the elevators are down, stairs are all chained, and Bud, he's indisposed." Olivia's legs gave out. She crawled behind a reception desk, fumbling for a landline. Dead air. The man began humming, a nursery rhyme off-key as he descended the stairs. She sprinted to the south wing, where motion sensors still worked. The lights flicked on, revealing his silhouette waiting at the far end. He'd circled back. For 2 hours it became a game. He herded her through supply closets, storage rooms, the empty cafeteria. Once, she hid in a ceiling vent, sobbing silently as he tapped the metal beneath her with his knife. Another time, she armed herself with a fire extinguisher, spraying him in the eyes, but he only laughed, licking the foam off his lips. "You'll taste better," he whispered. The final chase began when Olivia reached the rooftop access door. It was bolted, but she'd seen the maintenance key taped behind a pipe last summer. Her frozen fingers pried it free. The rooftop was icy, the city lights distant below. She dialed 911, her voice raw. "Crestview Tower, 22nd floor, please." A gloved hand wrenched the phone away. He'd followed her up, silent as smoke. "They won't come," he said, pressing the blade to her throat. His breath reeked of menthol and decay. "I cut the lines, and your guard." He begged for his mommy before he died. Olivia kneed him in the groin. He staggered and she ran, not toward the door, but the edge. The city spun below. She climbed the parapet, wind whipping her hair. The man lunged. For a split second they teetered. Then gravity took over. Later, the police would find Bud's body in the break room, a half-eaten sandwich beside him. Olivia's laptop still open, her audit unsaved. And on the rooftop, a single work boot, its sole smeared with blood and gravel. No witnesses, no CCTV footage, just a 911 call that disconnected too soon. Maya reported her missing at dawn. The detective assigned to the case would note the odd details, the unlocked stairwell, the disconnected server, the lack of fingerprints. But in the end, it was filed under unsolved. Crestview's executives paid for extra security. The 22nd floor was renovated. Life moved on. Though sometimes, night janitors swear they hear footsteps in the east wing, and a faint, wet humming just beyond the light.
Next story.
The night was alive with pulsing music, neon lights, and the chaotic energy of a club packed to the brim, with bodies swaying, laughing, and shouting over the bass-heavy beats. Luna had never been one for crowded places, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was here for a reason she couldn't quite explain to herself, let alone to her best friend Mia, who had dragged her out of their shared apartment with promises of letting loose and living a little. Luna had reluctantly agreed, though her mind was elsewhere. She had been feeling off for weeks, like a shadow was following her, lurking just out of sight. But tonight, she told herself, she would push those thoughts aside. Tonight, she would try to be normal. The club was called Eclipse, a sprawling, multi-level venue with dim lighting, smoky air, and a labyrinth of hallways that seemed to lead nowhere. Luna stuck close to Mia as they navigated the sea of people, their drinks sloshing in their hands. The music was so loud it felt like it was vibrating in her bones, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat, alcohol, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. Mia was already laughing, her head thrown back as she danced with a group of strangers, but Luna felt uneasy. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the faces, the shadows, the corners where the light didn't quite reach. It started with a feeling, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there. Just the crowd, the lights, the noise. She shook it off, telling herself she was being paranoid. But then she saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the dance floor, his eyes locked on hers. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating expression that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't look away when she caught his gaze. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made her stomach churn. Luna turned back to Mia, her hands trembling as she grabbed her friend's arm. "We should go," she said, her voice barely audible over the music. Mia frowned, leaning in closer. "What? Why? We just got here." Luna shook her head, her eyes darting back to where the man had been standing. He was gone. Her breath hitched and she scanned the crowd, her heart pounding. I don't feel good. I think I need some air." Mia sighed but nodded, grabbing Luna's hand and leading her toward the exit. The cool night air hit Luna like a slap, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. They stood outside the club, the bass from inside still thumping through the walls. Mia lit a cigarette, offering one to Luna, who declined. "You okay?" Mia asked, her brow furrowed. Luna nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "Yeah, I thought I saw someone." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Someone? Like an ex or something?" Luna shook her head. "No, just someone creepy. It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As they stood there, Luna's eyes wandered to the alley beside the club. It was dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. And there, standing in the shadows, was the man. He was watching her again, his expression unreadable. Luna's breath caught in her throat, and she grabbed Mia's arm. "We need to go, now." Mia followed her gaze, her eyes widening as she saw the man. "What the hell? Who is that?" Luna didn't answer. She just pulled Mia toward the street, flagging down a cab as fast as she could. The ride home was tense. Luna kept glancing out the back window, half expecting to see the man following them. But the streets were empty. and by the time they reached their apartment, she had almost convinced herself it was all in her head. Almost. The next few days passed in a blur. Luna tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over her. She started noticing little things. A car parked outside her building for hours at a time, a figure standing across the street when she left for work, the sound of footsteps behind her when she walked home at night. She told herself it was coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. Then, one night, it all came to a head. Luna was home alone, Mia having gone out with friends. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Luna was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her, trying to focus on the book in her hands. But her mind kept wandering, her eyes flicking to the windows, the doors, the shadows in the corners of the room. She jumped at every creak, every rustle of the wind outside. And then she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Her heart stopped. She sat frozen, her eyes locked on the door. The knock came again, louder this time. "Mia?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Slowly she stood, her legs shaking as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. It was him. The man from the club. He was standing there, his face calm, his eyes cold, and he was holding something, a knife. Luna stumbled back, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. But before she could hit call, she heard the sound of the lock turning. He was inside. What followed was a nightmare. Luna ran, her screams echoing through the apartment as she tried to find a place to hide. She locked herself in the bathroom, but he broke the door down with terrifying ease. She fought, scratching, kicking, biting, but he was too strong. He dragged her out of the apartment, his hand clamped over her mouth to stifle her screams. She could feel the cold metal of the knife pressed against her side, his breath hot on her neck as he whispered, "Don't make a sound." He took her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. He tied her to a chair, his movements methodical, almost clinical. Luna sobbed, begging him to let her go, but he just smiled that same cold smile. "You should have stayed at the club," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You would have been safer there." Hours passed, though it felt like days. He taunted her, playing with the knife, tracing the blade along her skin without breaking it. He told her things, horrible things, about what he had done to others, what he was going to do to her. Luna's mind spiraled, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and desperation. She tried to think of a way out, but every plan seemed impossible. She was trapped, helpless. And then, just when she thought it was over, she saw her chance. He had stepped away for a moment, leaving the knife on a table just out of her reach. Luna's heart raced as she strained against the ropes, her wrists raw and bleeding. She could see the knife, so close, yet so far. She stretched, her fingers brushing the handle, and with one final desperate effort, she grabbed it. The next few moments were a blur. She cut herself free, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the knife. She could hear him coming back, his footsteps echoing through the warehouse. She hid behind a stack of crates, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He called out to her, his voice calm, almost amused. "You can't hide from me, Luna." She waited, her heart pounding in her chest until he was close enough. Then she lunged, plunging the knife into his side. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, and she didn't wait to see if he would fall. She ran, her legs carrying her as fast as they could, out of the warehouse, into the night. She didn't stop until she reached a gas station where she collapsed, sobbing, into the arms of a startled clerk. The police arrived soon after, but the man was gone. The warehouse was empty, the only evidence of what had happened, the blood on Luna's hands and the rope still tied to the chair. They searched for him, but he was like a ghost, vanishing into the night. Luna never felt safe after that. She moved out of the apartment, changed her number, even changed her appearance. But no matter how far she ran, she could never shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake up to the sound of a soft knock at her door. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling tale of terror and suspense, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Remember, the shadows are always watching, and danger can lurk where you least expect it. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and keep the lights on.